BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
This podcast contains adult themes, very strong language, and language that may offend. April 1970. The Black House, Holloway Road, North London. Michael Abdul-Malik sits behind a large desk in his big, smoke-filled office, surrounded by his followers. Behind Michael, there's a large framed picture of a bearded Malcolm X, pointing while giving a speech. On his desk is a stack of books, his own autobiography, alongside some African ornaments. He beckons one of his men to usher in someone from the next room, a man named Marvin Brown. Frightened and wary, Marvin is made to sit on a chair in the middle of the room. This is how he described his experience to the police.
About 25 to 30 men were seated around the edge of the room. A man approached me with a medieval neckband. He put the band on my neck. He then jerked my head up and pulled the band tight until it hurt my throat. Another man punched me in the face. They made me parade around the room holding the band around my neck. I was then asked by Michael X,
"How much money do you owe me?"
The band around Marvin's neck was actually an antique slave collar. The act of dragging him around the room was supposed to be a morbid symbol of the tables turning, retribution in action against the white man. But this incident took place in 1970, and by then, Michael was a notorious Black Power leader with a following and his own headquarters. But how did he get there? When we left Michael in the last episode, it was 1963. He was in prison for stealing a few cans of paint. He had nabbed them from the ship he was working on to decorate his new flat in North London. Someone ratted on him, and it was reported to the police. Considering everything else Michael had been up to previously, and his attempts to go straight, it was stinging to be locked up for something so minor. Aged 30, he had an uncertain future ahead of him. In this episode, Michael will find his calling, reinvent himself into a Black Power leader, and catapult himself into the nation's consciousness. My name is Hamza Salmi, and this is Who Was Michael X? Episode 3, Malcolm X.
I suppose his politics really started to develop, and people want to put a label on you. And I think sometimes your life is constantly moving. And we as people are moving and changing and evolving and becoming something other than we were yesterday. And I think that was happening for him, and it happened very quickly.
That's Hasina, Michael's daughter. Michael's bout in prison affected her elder sisters. Without a home, they were removed from Desiree, their mother, and sent to live with nuns in Gloucestershire. Desiree wanted nothing more to do with him.
The 3 months soon went, so did my marriage. I had one visit every 4 weeks from Desiree, and our relationship deteriorated completely. I told her I was going back to hustling when I got out, and she wouldn't have any part of it.
Out of prison and separated from his wife, Michael de Freitas dived headfirst into a hustler's life. He quickly set up a shebeen in Notting Hill and made enough dough to put a deposit down on a house in Islington for Desiree and the children. Desiree was able to quit her job as a maid, and they retrieved the children from the home. Although the two were separated and sort of living a dual life, Michael was a family man and spent as much time as possible with them.
My sisters describe him as very fun-loving. He would come home and they would rush from wherever they were, and they would stand at the top of the stairs and scream, "Daddy, catch." And wherever he was, he would race to the bottom of the stairs where they would be throwing themselves and he would catch them. He was that dad.
Desiree might have been heartbroken over the situation they found themselves in, but just as Michael had started to see other women, she replied in kind.
Being my mother, when they separated, she didn't sit on her laurels. She had an affair with, or not an affair, a relationship. My dad went to see Nina Simone and realized that my mother and her lover were in the front row, and he was not amused. That she was in the front row. So I think he realized that she was doing stuff and getting on with her own thing.
Financially, Michael was flourishing, just as Notting Hill was. Gentrification was starting to take hold of the slums, as once condemned housing became desirable for the middle classes. Michael took account of this trend and moved with it, helping to redevelop housing for rent and sale, and all the while dabbling in legitimate and, of course, illegal businesses.
I devoted myself to making money. I succeeded and began to buy a few leases on places here and there and re-let them. Money made more money, and I opened another basement gaming house, the most elaborate that Notting Hill had known.
Michael decorated the gambling house with luxury fittings and service. He hired French hostesses to serve free food and drink to the clientele. With the success of the gaming house, he even created an illicit pawnbrokers for the gamblers to use when they ran out of money and were looking to use their belongings as collateral. Despite all of this, Michael still yearned for something different. It was the same desire that had pushed him to go straight before.
This period was something of a crossroads in my life. I was racing around, not having much of an idea where I was going and what I wanted out of life. And then I met Nancy, and everything began to change.
Nancy Bacall was a white Jewish woman from Montreal and working for the Canadian Broadcasting Company in London as a journalist. The two met at a friend's house and soon began a relationship that would last 5 years. They moved in together in Nancy's flat in Primrose Hill. Nancy had a profound impact on Michael, opening him up to a different world. Through her, he would meet and become good friends with the likes of Leonard Cohen, the singer-songwriter, who was a childhood friend of Nancy, and also the writer Alexander Trocchi. Although Michael was an avid reader, she broadened his horizons with new authors such as James Baldwin and Norman Mailer, took him to the theatre and pushed him to educate himself. He would enroll in a college in Holborn to obtain some O-levels, with the aim of getting into Oxford University with the help of Councillor Donald Chesworth. Michael simultaneously was inhabiting two worlds, one of a black hustler's life, violence and crime, and that of a white middle-class bohemian dabbling in the arts. Michael challenged stereotypes, and moving between worlds was then and would always be a talent of his. His longtime friend and fellow Trinidadian Sir Horace Ove, the esteemed filmmaker, had a story that explains as much, while speaking at the Barbican in 2005 at a viewing of his seminal film, Pressure.
Michael X? No, quite a character. Heavy. Michael could take you on every level of society. Michael, I'll give you an idea of what I'm saying then. All right, Michael X could be on the block with all the hustlers, the drug dealers, I mean white and black and heavy and everything on one scene. And 2 hours after, he said, I have an appointment, and he's up somewhere else with lady this and lord so and so and so and that so and so, and that was his kind of life. He moved that way. Michael X went to the head of the police station in Ladbroke Grove to tell him that racism got to stop and you've got to stop attacking black people in the street and treating them this way, and the police got to do something. And he arrived in a convertible, I think it was a Chev or something, with the police inspector daughter in the car waiting for him. Carry on from there, you know, Michael.
It was a red Thunderbird that he was rocking up in, actually, an American car. One of the lingering signs of his pimping days, along with the loud attire and his hands dripping in rings. These all melted away with the influence of Nancy. She also caused Michael to pause, to look introspectively, to ask why he found himself in the position of a hustler.
I wanted to cut my ties with the ghetto again. It was a connection that seemed to blinker me so that I never saw the world outside. The gaming house, which continued to provide me with some money, was merely stumbling along in my absence. I no longer found it exciting or desirable to be there. Nancy was rather moralistic about hustling, just the way Desiree had been, and was constantly pressuring me to stop wasting my life, running around in circles, and do something worthwhile.
Nancy was progressive, but her family were not. A family member in London said to Michael directly that a black man shouldn't be with Nancy. While visiting her family in Canada, her mother was apoplectic at the thought of the two marrying. The shame of Michael's hustling wasn't even the chief obstacle for the family. The issue was an interracial relationship. Nancy's mother ranted about the problem with black people around the world. This traumatic experience for Michael, being denigrated for his race, caused him to contemplate. Being mixed race, Michael had at times benefited from his colour, such as in Trinidad. At other times he was just black, no nuance. Sometimes he caught praise and flack from both sides of the racial divide. What he was confronting, however, was something that was in the air, an awakening of sorts.
My efforts to go straight were still not meeting with any resounding success, but I couldn't go back to hustling. In fact, I couldn't go into Notting Hill. Instead, I began frequenting a new scene, looking for something intangible. I started visiting all the centers where black people congregated. The West Indian Community Center, the Congress of African Unity headquarters, all sorts of places where one could eat African food, browse in the libraries, and talk to people in the discussion rooms. It was at the Congress of African Unity headquarters in Earl's Court that I met Malcolm.
He's a 38-year-old Nebraskan. His name was Malcolm Little. But now, because it's a name of servitude, he's known to the world simply as Malcolm X. Can I first of all clear up your name? Was it in fact Malcolm Little?
I don't think it was in fact. If it was in fact, I would have let it remain. Little was the name of the man who formerly owned my grandfather as a slave. So I gave it back.
So do people now address you as Mr. X?
Mr. X, Malcolm X. We want to be recognized and respected as human beings. And we have a motto. Our motto is, by any means necessary.
By any means. By any means.
By any means.
It's Tuesday, the 9th of February, 1965. Malcolm X arrives in London, back from Paris, where he's just been rejected entry on the grounds that there is a threat to his life. The threat is real, whether it's from the CIA, the Nation of Islam, or the FBI. Malcolm X is a dead man walking. Recently out of the Nation of Islam, in a fractious battle with their leader Elijah Muhammad, before leaving the United States, he had been on a mission to Los Angeles to uncover a scandal concerning Elijah Muhammad and a number of his secretaries who he had made pregnant. While there, he dodged the Nation of Islam with the help of some of his followers on the West Coast. One of them, a man called Hakeem Jamal. Remember the name. Hakeem will become fated with Michael in the years to come. But for now, let's focus on Malcolm. He had taken the Black American cause international. On his extensive travels around the world, he'd met with many a world leader and was treated as a statesman, much to the annoyance and worry of the American government. In just 11 days' time, Malcolm X will be dead, assassinated in Harlem's Audubon Ballroom. Despite the threats to his life, Malcolm, tired and sick, is undeterred. Invited by a slew of UK organisations, he tries to help where he can, and it's at one such event that Michael and Malcolm meet. Michael introduces himself, and after pleasantries, he invites Malcolm to visit his home later that evening.
When I got home that afternoon, I told Nancy that Malcolm X would be around that evening. I felt quite sure that he would come. Nancy was rather worried, as she understood that he was a terrible racist. But I said I didn't intend to hide her, and in fact, I would like her to meet him.
Nancy's initial apprehension was allayed by Malcolm's friendliness to her. They spoke of politics, family, and his travels, all the while listening to Michael's records and bonding over their fondness of Aretha Franklin. At 1 a.m. they drove Malcolm to his hotel with a promise to meet the next day at the London School of Economics. Here, Malcolm, to a packed audience and at the invitation of the Africa Society, he enthralled not only the students, but Michael too. To him it was the best speech he had ever heard. He set his world alight. Later that evening, Nancy and Michael took him on a tour of Notting Hill, where he addressed a meeting at the All Saints Church Hall. The two were becoming inseparable, and Malcolm invited Michael for the next day's visit, on the 12th, to a town called Smethwick.
Fine work, and somewhere to live. Now, what we're going to discuss tonight are some of the problems, housing, social relations, working relations, which are concerning people around here.
And to add to the feeling of insecurity, there has arrived an army of total strangers, immigrants. West Indians and Indians have come to Smethwick's foundries because there's work. They earn more in a month here than in a whole year in Jamaica or the mud villages of the Punjab where they came from.
Smethwick is a town on the outskirts of Birmingham, England's second largest city. And at the time of Michael and Malcolm's visit in 1965, the local Conservative Council had plans to segregate its streets and schools along racial lines. Malcolm had been invited by the Indian Workers Association to bring to light these plans and to show him the colour bar in operation. Malcolm arrived with Michael in tow. He walked down one of the residential streets alone, with reporters and a news crew recording. Locals came out and shouted that they didn't want blacks there. While there, he had this to say.
And the Negro community makes a mistake when it tries to say we're as good as you are, because they're admitting that you're better. I personally don't endorse that. I think that the non-white community should be itself, and in being itself, it should develop all of its own natural potential and go forward.
50 years later, I walked that very same street and spoke to the locals who lived there. The difference couldn't have been starker. The majority of people living there were of Asian heritage. Everyone was very friendly, both Asian and white. It made me wonder how things would have turned out had the council been successful. You see, Malcolm has always been a hero to me, someone who I admired for many reasons. The ability to recognize his mistakes and change, his devotion to a cause, and his selflessness are just some. Whilst in Smethwick, I went to a local library to see what they had on Malcolm. It was here that the librarian uttered the words that 7 years later would lead me to your ears.
I think if you're interested in Malcolm X, you should have a look at Michael X.
Michael who? Well, actually, this is the perfect time to say how Michael got that moniker of X. You see, the story goes that Malcolm phoned up the organisers the night before, telling them that he needed another hotel room for his brother, Michael. So when they put down his name for the room, they wrote Michael X. The Sunday Times, when covering the Smethwick story, referred to him in kind, and so Michael de Freitas became Michael X. No Nation of Islam affiliation, yet. The truth? It's more likely that Michael grabbed that mistake and ran with it, promoting it himself. I don't blame him. He was in awe of Malcolm X, as were most people who met him. I've read so many accounts of the impact that Malcolm would have on people, even if they only knew him briefly. If a little stardust came off him, being a natural hustler, Michael was sure to make the most of it. I told you before that Malcolm was a dead man walking. Malcolm knew he had not long to live. He told people of this on his visit to the UK, Michael included. But that didn't stop his activism, or his return to his family and home in the United States.
Allahu Akbar. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un.
On the 21st of February, 1965, Malcolm is gunned down in Harlem. Malcolm's martyrdom unleashed waves of transformation that we still feel today. His example led to movements, political parties, progress. Michael was a part of that by being inspired to change.
Malcolm, he was a friend of mine. I liked him very much. You could say I loved that man. He was a wonderful person. And I would say that I have been influenced in some extent to things what it is he tried to do.
De Freitas himself says that after he came here, the Merchant Navy rejected him because of his color. Angered by discrimination, he admits he used to live immorally.
In an area of misfits, you have all manner of people. You have prostitutes, ponces, drug addicts, drug peddlers. You have everything. I lived in that area. I lived among those people. I shared their misery and their torture and their torment.
Now, all these pitfalls you've talked about, gambling, prostitution, drugs and so on, have you put all this behind you now?
I mean, if I still partake in any of these things, no, my complete life is tied up into the Racial Adjustment Action Society.
This is from a BBC Panorama programme interview in the year after Malcolm's death, and it's conducted by the same journalist that only a few years before was chasing Michael in the street for his association with Peter Rackman and his past as an enforcer. Inspired by Malcolm's example, Michael quickly set to work creating his own organisation to fight against racism in the country. The aims of the Racial Adjustment Action Society were ambitious. Here are just a few.
1. Guarantee by all means possible the human rights of all coloured peoples in Britain. 2. Re-examine the whole question of our identity as black men. 3. Protect our religious and social and cultural heritage.
The headquarters of De Freitas' organisation, which has no formal membership, are in a room in Islington. Here he's helped by the man on his left, 39-year-old Jan Carew, author of the bestseller Black Midas, who comes from British Guiana, and by Roy Saw, the movement's national organiser, also from British Guiana. What is there here which can bring a man of Carew's stature to the side of a man like De Freitas?
Jan Carew, an academic and an editor of a magazine at the time, was quite the coup for Michael to have on his team. He had also met Malcolm during his visit, and in later years would write a book about his encounter. Jan had pedigree and knowledge to help the cause.
I came into contact with it through meeting Michael, of whom I had heard so much that was bad. But I, in fact, judge every human being according to the degree of compassion he possesses for the other man. We are not going to react to terror by kneeling on the street and singing hymns. We have arrived at a stage in this century where we've already stood up and stretched limbs stiff from too much kneeling. We are now standing up as men and facing the world.
Michael and his team didn't know it at the time, But as with others of their generation who founded similar organizations, they were setting down the foundations of a nascent Black Power movement, one which later generations would build upon.
Roy Saw, who claims that he can't get a decent job because of his colour, often takes the message of the De Freitas group to Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. I listened to him there yesterday afternoon, among an audience that was predominantly coloured.
And one must not forget that it was the English people who taught us, if you want to fight fire, then you must take fire to fight fire. And they were proud to tell us. They educated us. They civilized us. Then let us, the poor and the humble people, take their education and beat them at their own game. If we
Roy Saw was an aggressive little man of about 34 who looked 10 years younger. He had his own following and had been preaching more or less the same line as mine at Hyde Park Corner. He had strong feelings about the plight of black men in this country and felt that the only way we would get things done was in unity.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to Hyde Park. I spoke there for 30 years.
You are paranoid, psychopathic, disordered pattern behavior.
Very psychopathic for me, and I'll give you £5. But I must warn you, it has been devalued.
I remember my first time I spoke in Hyde Park, I must have spent about 15 minutes. When I retired, I wouldn't finish until 5-6 hours every Sunday.
That's Roy Saw today. He's in his late 80s. Although, as to be expected, he's a tad frail, his wit and sense of humour is still very sharp. It took me a long time to find and speak to Roy. I eventually found him in Australia, where he was kind and happy to talk about his history with Michael, Ras, and his own notable contribution to Black Power in the UK.
Once you start fighting for justice, and you see injustice anywhere, you stand up and you talk about it. You stand up and oppose it. We only live once, and if you can't help your fellow being, what's the point of you living?
Roy is one of the most famous orators in Speaker's Corner history. This corner of Hyde Park is a traditional spot for open-air debating, where you can say nearly anything you want and not be moved on or arrested. Today, it's mostly a battleground for religious debate, but in previous decades, it was very political. And it's here that the fiery yet humorous Roy came to the attention of Michael X.
He heard about me, and he came down one Sunday to meet me. And when I finished speaking, he went up to me and said, "Hello, let's go and have a coffee." For somebody to buy me a coffee, that was great. I found him interesting because he fed me with knowledge of what lifestyle was like in Notting Hill Gate. And then he introduced me to an organization he formed called RAS, Racial Adjustment Action Society. And the name fitted the cause we were fighting for, want to readjust the racial imbalance. I became secretary of his organization, and I took it upon myself to travel in England, where black people lived, and try to form a branch. Every week I will go to a different area. I'll go in on Monday, I'll do some leaflet and distribute it, and hold a meeting on Saturday. Come back Sunday for Hyde Park, have a meeting with Michael, tell him what I'm doing. He tells me what he does, and that's how we build a relationship.
The name Ras was also a play on words, which Michael found funny to get the media to constantly say it on air. Years later, in an interview on TV, he would be asked about this name and its meaning.
In a review of your book, of your life story of yourself, Colin McInnes, of whom you've spoken highly, said that the word ras was also a Jamaican word for a lady's sanitary towel. Is this true?
Well, that's not exactly what it means. It really means a menstrual blood clot, which is quite
quite different than a lady's sanitary towel.
Is this a joke, or is there some special meaning in calling your organization by such a name?
It is a word which sounds very nice coming from my lips. Like when I say Ras, it doesn't sound like when you say Ras. Like very often I find white people or people of pale pigmentation use the word nigger, and it doesn't sound attractive coming from their lips. But when I wake up in the morning and my woman looks at me and she tells me, "Get up, nigger," it sounds so sweet that I get sexy and turned on. When it is I hear it coming from the lips of someone of pale pigmentation, it sounds as if it's a swear word, or if they're telling me something which is very nasty. It depends on who is the person uttering the phrases.
Well, Michael X, as the leader of Ras, was uttering a lot of phrases, and not all of them true, and many were controversial at the time. What they garnered, however, was the attention and notoriety which he welcomed. Any attention to bring light to the plight of black people in the UK, but also to enhance his status as a British version of Malcolm X. Ras was received with dread by the establishment, that a militant black organisation along American political lines had risen out of the British black population. Racial politics was seen as something foreign to Britain.
His appeal basically was that the West Indian was a degraded man. He was degraded because of his conditions of slavery under which he lived for the last 300 years, that he could seize control of himself once again, he could seize control of his own destiny, he could stand up and be a man. It was in fact very, very close indeed to the sort of arguments Malcolm X was putting up when I saw him in New York.
And it moved his audience?
I think it did. I think it did.
And what's your own assessment of De Freitas and his organisation?
De Freitas is a bombastic and unpredictable, boastful man. For example, he told me that he could put 6 or 7 members of Parliament up at Westminster after the next election, and that he would then hold the balance of power between the two major parties. This is clearly nonsense. He told me if he wanted to, he could take over the government of the West Indies. This is clearly nonsense. He's told me that he's got 17 bus garages in London closely organised already. One wonders whether this is true or not. But merely because he provides these wild and unstable, unsupportable stories, we should not ignore him and laugh him off.
The British state began to move slowly but surely into a response to this new threat, which they thought could inspire or incite the immigrant populations. The media, however, revelled in the character. Both Michael and the press had a symbiotic relationship in these early days. As the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, who knew Michael, explains.
What was beginning to happen was that the British media wanted an articulate political voice to tell them what the black community was thinking. And Michael X was very articulate, had the gift of the gab. And he could see that there was a role of kind of local leadership combined with media visibility for him, and he took that and set up this organization.
Outwardly, Michael De Freitas had reinvented himself into Michael X, a defiant and unbowed black man in Britain. But to complete his transformation within himself, he had to confront the cause of his inner turmoil, his mother, Iona. A few months after Malcolm's killing, and just as he was finding his own fame, Iona is arrested for running a brothel. She gives her son's surname of De Freitas, rather than her own maiden name of Brown, to the police. Michael feels humiliated. He decides to write a letter to her, to once and for all disavow her racial prejudice.
Dear Mama, my hand is shaking and my heart hurts. I want to tell you a few things, for I am not afraid anymore. I am a Negro. You told me I was different. It's not true. I tried to be. I was ashamed, not of being a Negro, but of you.
In the next episode of Who Was Michael X, the heavyweight champion of the world comes to town.
It was the kind of a punch that numbs you. All you know is you're hit, you're shook up, you're down.
And Michael X helps to create the legendary Notting Hill Carnival.
And I told the boys, let's walk.
By the time we got back, hundreds of people following.
Who Was Michael X was presented, written and produced by Hamza Salmi. Featuring Peter DeJersey as Michael X, assistant producer Wayland Mackenzie, researcher Palumi Odubanjo, technical producer Tim Heffer, theme music by Kyron Akau, production mentors Claire Walker and Joe Kent, executive producers Kalik Mir and Liane Ali, commissioned for BBC Sounds Audio Lab by Kalik Mir.